So it looks as though Hollywood studios finally figured out how to make video game movies that make money. Hi, my name's Jakob, and where other people see entertainment, I sometimes see bar charts. So, the Super Mario Galaxy movie, specifically, has made, as of when I'm recording this, $750 million worldwide. Well, in excess of $750 million worldwide, kind of sort of evenly split between domestic and the rest of the world sort of box office, right? And I'm here to kind of talk about it because I have a feeling that it matters. But before we go any further, do all the YouTube things. Like, follow, share, subscribe, ring the bell, tell your friends, I don't know. If you like what you're seeing, feel free to support me. If you want to have a chat with me, leave a comment, do all the things. Also, check out my website where I write about movies, and I have been writing about movies for years. And check out my podcast where I talk about movies, and I have done so for years as well. And and stick around because I don't know what's coming now. Maybe a bunch of minutes of me ranting unopposed about why the Super Mario Galaxy movie and its success kind of sort of matters. So let's just get into this, shall we? So the question is, why is that movie particularly so important to this conversation? Or why is this movie important to the culture at large, right? First of all, it's a good signal. It made us $750 million, and its predecessor, the Super Mario Bros. Movie from 2023, made in excess of $1 billion. And that actually matters because it kind of shows you, or at least indicates that maybe Hollywood studios have figured out how to make profitable movies based on video games that actually connect with audiences, or that the culture has been primed to receive them, or both. So the reasons why the Super Mario Brothers film, or the Super Mario Bros. Movie, and the Super Mario Galaxy movie specifically, so these two now having made just between the two nearly $2 billion at the box office, the reason why they are such massive successes, I think it's threefold. Right? First of all, they are family oriented, so they are 4-quadrant experiences. They try to appeal to everyone. Second of all, and I think this is the most important bit that's going to be, relevant to what I think I have to say in the next couple of minutes, is that they acknowledge the gaming experience. They don't try to pretend that the game they've adapted is like doesn't matter. All they're interested is the character that people would be connecting to, or some kind of world building, or the story, but they acknowledge the idea of, or the game mechanics, or the ideas the games specifically nurtured and cultured, right? And also, they treat the matter of adapting this thing seriously, but not more seriously than the game treats itself. I think this is going to make sense in a few minutes, but that's kind of like the big three reasons why these three co-productions between Nintendo and Universal have made such a profound impact on culture. And also, this extends to other films, right? Because these are not the first sort of video game movies in the recent years to actually have made considerable amounts of money, but these are the ones that made the most, right? You think about last year, we had a Minecraft movie. And actually, the clue is actually in the title already, when you think about it. It's not Super Mario Bros. It's the Super Mario Bros. Movie. So it's a movie about a game, if that makes any sense. The Super Mario Bros. Or the Super Mario Galaxy movie. It's not Super Mario Galaxy. We're not trying to appeal directly to the game or the story itself, but we're acknowledging the game exists as a game. I'm not sure if it makes any sense to anyone, but just semantically speaking, as far as just using words to express opinions or express thoughts, there's already a tell in the title, like a Minecraft movie. It's not Minecraft, like Warcraft. It's a Minecraft movie. It's a movie about the gaming experience of Minecraft. Fair enough, because the story behind Minecraft, let's just say, like, there's not much to mine in Minecraft when it comes to storytelling or world building. It's all about the experience or memes associated with it, you know. You can see movies like this, like Sonic the Hedgehog, all three of them, and Five Nights at Freddy's, or both movies, and I have to acknowledge here, I thoroughly, passionately detested both of them, but I acknowledge the fact that they made a lot of money and connected with a lot of people, right? It's just not my cup of tea, okay? But I think it just speaks to the same trend that video game movies somehow became popular, right? It actually also looks like, you know, it's taken almost exactly 30 years for Hollywood to figure out how to take these video game sort of materials, this intellectual property, this sort of cultural phenomenon of kids, young adults, teenagers, and adults spending time entertaining themselves by playing video games, you know, which is widespread. Like I've grown up with video games myself. Like it's been personally important to me to see video games that I cared about translated into movies correctly or in the way that I would find entertaining, and there was always something wrong with them, even though the idea of seeing them was sometimes enough just to pass the time or something, right? But it's taken them like 3 decades. Like think about it. The first official Hollywood adaptation of a video game film is a 1993 Super Mario Bros. Starring John Leguizamo and Bob Hoskins and Dennis Hopper. And it was a massive failure. It was a stupendous bomb, right? Did not work at all. And now, exactly 30 years later, in 2023, we have a movie titled The Super Mario Bros. Movie making in excess of $1 billion. So what changed in the intervening 3 decades? First of all, just to walk you through this, like there were times when I think video game adaptations would look like, oh, maybe they finally figured out how to connect with them. Like Mortal Kombat in 1995 made a lot of money. You know, like there were some blips of success, but only in like the early 2000s you could see like a sustained push where Lara Croft Tomb Raider and Resident Evil came out. And actually Resident Evil is an interesting sort of, let's just call it a singularity in here, because this is the only video game adapted franchise in existence that has been able to sustain profitability over the course of multiple entries, because it has, I don't know how many at this point. Only recently it has started it has stopped making money, right? But say the first 4 or 5 were considerable money makers, right? And you could, I don't know, maybe there's room to discuss what that might be, whether this is a Mila Jovovich sort of connection or Paul W.S. Anderson being kind of in charge of this for the first few entries. And actually Paul W.S. Anderson actually was one of those guys who actually felt, let's just say, connected to properties like that, because he actually did direct Mortal Kombat in 1995. So I don't know, but it just turned out that the game sort of fan base was okay with the project and okay with the franchise enough to show up for different installments. So I don't know, right? But over the course of the intervening, I think between the early 2000s and I want to say 2016, there were just like many fits and starts, mostly failures. Hitman, like I think Prince of Persia made some money, but I think very few of them would be considered profitable if you adjusted for production costs, and even fewer of them would be considered profitable if you adjusted for, call it, real-time production costs. So, which is like a proxy of this is usually like if a movie makes double its budget, usually it's in the green. Sometimes it's more, because it varies. It depends on how much money was spent on P&A, which is print and advertising or marketing, right? So, and how much money, how much of that sort of box office take has been generated domestically versus overseas, because the further away you are from the studio, the more middlemen you have to pay off. Therefore, the studio generates less and less money the further away from the source the cinema is. Like a movie opening in Japan will make considerably less than the same movie opening in, I don't know, in Florida. But it kind of took, I want to say, until 2016 to see, well, the first inkling of success, and of the kind of success that you could possibly see as hinting at what made video game movies click with audiences, and that would have been the Angry Birds movie, right? I know it's an adaptation of a mobile game, but it's, again, like it's a just wildly popular sort of title, right? But it was the first, I think so the Angry Birds movie was probably the first, or like in that year would have been the sort of the most profitable movie in that space, because it cost $73 million to make, and it took in receipts 350, and I think Resident Evil films, I mean, some of them would have probably just come close. Bear in mind, in 2016 you also had Warcraft, which in my opinion was like, I want to say 5 years too late to the party, to cash in on the sort of popularity on World of Warcraft specifically, because the third expansion, Wrath of the Lich King, and then the later one, Cataclysm, so the sort of the biggest sort of subscription numbers in that space, and then it just started declining from there. Warcraft made in excess of $400 million at the box office, but it cost 160 to make, and then there was a lot of marketing pushing it, so it barely made any money, and that's one of the reasons why no one followed it up with a sequel, right? Meanwhile, the Angry Birds got a sequel, okay? But that's, just bear this in mind. It took, like, why did the Angry Birds movie kind of connect with audiences, and something like Warcraft or Hitman Codename 47, or I don't know, something like that, Max Payne, didn't, right? So Angry Birds blazed the trail, and there's and I think this is it's a signifier of what would eventually make the entire genre as it is click, right? Because it was a triumph of just pure visual form and entertainment, accessible entertainment, over stuffing the movie with unnecessary world building or darkening everything, right? Because almost as though the filmmakers who would be normally making these movies were embarrassed about the game they were adapting, right? And maybe early doors, say in the 90s, it was a little bit different, because the visual form wasn't as defined. Because I don't know, if you adapt Super Mario Bros. In 1993, what you're adapting is a game whose visual experience is extremely sort of lo-fi, right? The graphics were great for the time, but say comparatively to where we are now, like you had to use a lot of imagination to imagine yourself in the shoes of the character. Meanwhile, now everything's kind of sort of photorealistic. It's much easier to convey that, right? And the boundary between what you can accomplish on the screen versus what you can accomplish while playing a game, that's been blurred sufficiently, right? Probably that also contributes. But say over the years, usually what the main criticism kind of just fell, I don't know, along, I want to say like 5 or 6 different lines. First of all, that would be tone mismatch. Again, kind of sort of like, it's almost as though filmmakers were embarrassed about like the inherent campiness of the video game they were adapting. Like Super Mario Bros. Could not succeed in their eyes as something silly. They would have to kind of just, like, dress it up a little bit, right? Make it dark, make it darker, make it slimier, and just get into some kind of a, I don't know, writer's room with a bunch of people and innovate and ideate about what can we use from this game, or how can we translate what we saw in the game into something that would correspond to real life, so we don't alienate audiences. But that creates this tone mismatch between what gamers or people who grew up watching or playing these games would then see in the cinema and say, this is not at all what I expected. This is not the experience that I recognize, right? Another thing would be story translation. And this is a bigger sort of issue in that many story-driven video games would be already sort of distillations of movie-based sort of entertainment. So people who write stories or invent worlds for video games to draw on. Say, I don't know, think about Skyrim or World of Warcraft is a good example, actually, because these would be people who would be in charge of building these worlds would be also nerds who grew up like reading Tolkien and watching Conan, like reading and watching high fantasy of some kind, and they would distill all these references into this gaming experience, and therefore adapting this gaming experience into a movie would kind of look like it's sort of bastardizing / plagiarizing classics of fantasy, right? So it would look unoriginal, but what made quote unquote unoriginal storytelling or world building particularly sticky when it came to a game was the fact that games were inherently interactive, like you're participatory, right? You don't get to watch things, you get to you get to just be a part of the world. So it really excuses a lot of these sort of unoriginalities, because like you get to be a night elf in World of Warcraft, and you can name your character Legolas. Probably you wouldn't be able to do it because there's already characters named like that, but theoretically you could pretend that you are a character from a book or a movie that you grew up watching, right? And that makes it okay. Another one would be people who adapt these things. Studios and filmmakers didn't necessarily grasp what made these games okay, and what they were being drawn to was the idea of taking a character and sort of luring the audiences into the cinema based on this sort of familiarity with the character. So I don't know, take Mortal Kombat for example, from 1995, and imagine that people would be drawn to watch this movie because they recognize the characters that they played, like Kano or Raiden, and they would go to see how they translate to a cinematic sort of treatment. And then maybe, well, there's a gamble whether they would excuse or refuse to excuse the sort of, I don't know, mismatch in tone or storytelling or whatever, right? But the idea was to kind of just get the character sort of look or aesthetics right, and not necessarily translate the depth and actually or nuances of that character, specifically because these nuances of the character would be very often tied to that participatory sort of appeal of the character. So video game protagonists very often, well, not very often, but they would sometimes feel kind of sort of hollow because they are supposed to function as avatars, because you are supposed to or you are supposed to fill in the blanks, so to speak. So you have to develop their characters, you have to develop their traits, you get to make decisions in as much as the game allows you to make them, right? But that was important, right? And but what I think was the most important was the idea of getting the gaming experience translated to the screen in a way that feels respectful to what gamers would have experienced while interacting with this game, right? And actually, what became even more instructive, it's not necessarily the Angry Birds film from 2016 or its sequel, but the sort of the success just before the pandemic of Pokemon Detective Pikachu and Sonic the Hedgehog. And with Sonic the Hedgehog comes this caveat. I don't know if you remember, there was this massive backlash when the first images of what Sonic would look like were shown to the public, and people lost their marbles because they looked at this character and they saw, hey, this doesn't look anything like the Sonic the Hedgehog I recognize. This is some kind of a hybrid sort of kill me now alien xenomorph hybrid. I don't know what this is. This is kind of like something that came out of an imagination of someone who hasn't even touched the game, only heard about it or saw pictures of it, right? And I don't want to have anything to do with this. So they boycotted this, and the studio went back to the drawing board and they reimagined the character, and that stuck. And that was a key moment, because it actually shows you, hey, we don't look. The audience is explicitly told them, like, if you do something that you think is good without consulting us, it's not gonna work. Think about what we want, and we are telling you what we want, which is we want the experience we've had with the game reflected respectfully on the screen. And they did it. And Sonic the Hedgehog made like in excess of $300 million, and all three of them made a lot of money. I think they make progressively more money with each sequel going forward, right? So that's a stunning success, right? They kind of married this fan expectation of, hey, this is what we want, and please respect the gaming experience that we've had and we cherish, and and we'd like to see it respectfully reflected on the screen with accessibility as well, because you don't want to alienate your base, but you also want to invite others. So this is where you craft a 4-quadrant experience, and for this you have many decades of material to work with. Pixar and Disney and whatever. There are recipes and formulas to get simple story archetypes to be baked into these experiences to carry the experience across. They don't have to be extremely convoluted. Like if you actually look at all these successful video game movies nowadays, they're extremely simple hero's journey stories, right? They're very easy to identify, they're easy to connect with, and that's why they work, right? Like the Super Mario Galaxy movie is essentially Frozen, you know, with extra steps, you know. Meanwhile, the first one is, again, it's a hero's journey. And why is this a hero's journey? Because the first game was that. It's about a guy who's going into a castle to save a princess, you know? It was very simple, right? But there's also an important caveat, because the story only comes secondary in these successful movies when the story is secondary to the game. When the story is the most important part of it. This is when you have to, like, filmmakers actually figured out, okay, well, they looked at these games and said, what makes them great? What makes them tick? And they looked at, okay, well, if we're going to adapt something like The Last of Us, like, the gaming experience comes secondary, but the story is what drives the sort of the fan appeal. So that's where you have to pay attention, right? And that's why it became a success, right? Again, caveats to all of this, because there's fan toxicity baked into the season 2 and whatever. I'm not going to get into this. And you can see there's a trend now with them making progressively more and more money, because they figured out that story comes secondary whenever they figured out that the game itself dictates what's the most important bit of the movie that you're going to be adapting it to, which is, if it's story driven, go with the story. If it's with the experience, go with the experience. If it's the visuals, and then it's the visuals. And also remember, if the mechanics are iconic or somehow revered in the fan sort of community, then you also have to make sure that you respectfully and appropriately reflect them, right? That's kind of how you marry the sort of the fan expectation, and also with accessibility, by just draping everything over simple archetypes, and making sure that the tone of the game matches the movie, and vice versa, right? And as a result, what you'll then come back, like a successful movie like this will then get the viewer to get fired up about the idea of, like, coming back home and just, like, turning on their Switch, okay, or PS5 or whatever, like, depending on what the actual movie was, right? That's a mark of a successful video game adaptation. If you can get the viewer to say, "Oh, I'm glad I went to see this. Now I want to just go and play some Mario Kart. I don't know why, but I want to." That means that's been a success. Okay, and most importantly, and this is the big sort of crux of it all, is that this wouldn't have been able to happen, I want to say, in 2015 or 2014. This had to happen now, or over the course of the last, I want to say, 6 years, right? And that's because a gap has opened up in the culture to allow these movies to ascend, because they are kind of on an upward trajectory. We haven't seen the apex just yet. You'll see in a second, right? Because there is a comparative case you can draw from to see how the trajectory of video game movies taking 30 years for filmmakers and studio producers to figure out how to make them into something successful and culturally sustainable. The trajectory of video game movies mimics somewhat the cultural trajectory of comic book movies. And the gap that has opened up has to do with the realization that as the video game movies are ascending in cultural relevance, comic book movies are now in progressively steeper decline. Okay, and if you look at, I don't know, just all the comic book movies that have been produced in Hollywood over the course ever since, I want to say, call it 1978 Superman. You can trace it all the way back to 1966 Batman if you want, but then again, it's an isolated case and a lot of TV in between. But say, if you look through that, you can also understand that it has taken Hollywood filmmakers almost exactly 30 years to get a considerable level of sustained success. Maybe slightly less than 30 years, because you can say there is a gap of, I want to say, 22 years between Superman and X-Men in 2000, right? Where you can see the first sort of inklings of success. So if I mapped it all over what I just talked about in with respect to video game movies, like X-Men was like the Angry Birds, or Angry Birds is like the X-Men of its time. Like, it was a movie that showed studios like, oh, that sticks, that works, right? because before that you couldn't really like find a sustainable trend. There was Superman and its sequels, and they petered out quite quickly. There's Tim Burton's Batman was a massive success, and then from then on, just filmmakers had no idea how to, or studios had no idea how to really milk it properly and how to kind of just build a micro genre around it. It was all fits and starts once again, right? Until we find Bryan Singer comes out with X-Men, and then Sam Raimi comes out with Spider-Man in 2002, and all of a sudden these movies start making considerable money, and sustainably so, because X2 and X-Men 3 make money. Spider-Man 2 makes a lot of money. Spider-Man 3, even for all its shenanigans in production and everything, still made a lot of money, right? But you can see that the real sort of first inkling of success came in 2008, where you had the release of The Dark Knight and Iron Man, which was the first movie in the MCU, right? I think in the same year also had The Incredible Hulk, which didn't connect as well with audiences. But you can see that was I won't say 2008 was for comic book movies for comic book movies what the sort of the early 2020s were for video game movies, where actually they started connecting, like they started seeing returns. And it's important to understand why that was, because MCU connected with people, first of all, because it was made by people who were like intrinsically connected to the world of comic books. And I think this is where the similarities will start showing up, because before the year 2000, I want to say, and specifically before the arrival of the MCU and DCEU and whatnot, you could possibly argue that movies tried to almost separate themselves from the comic book experience. They would rewrite the lore, they would rewrite the aesthetics, and then almost again, like video game movies, I just said, video game movies were kind of embarrassed about being based on video games, so they had to just, like, I don't know, make them a little bit edgy, make them a little bit more serious, or I don't know, just again, very self-conscious, right? And early comic book films kind of were like that too, as in, like, they were allowing filmmakers to make their own stamp on these materials, and some of them are really great. Like, I'm a massive fan of Tim Burton's Batman, for instance. I do love, for weird reasons, Batman Forever, but you can see that ideas around comic book movies were kind of circling around this of the concept of what can we take out of the comic book experience and translate to the cinema, and what can we leave behind, because there is a lot of cringy stuff in there that we don't want, because we feel like we don't know if it's gonna stick. And it turns out in the 2000s and late 2000s, it was shown quite clearly that what really sticks is the experience that people beforehand found cringy, which is, it comes back to respecting the material first. So if you're adapting Batman, you kind of want to make it dark, because Batman comics are, most of them at least, are kind of on the darker side. If you want to adapt Superman, you have to actually just look at the character, look at what the tone of the material is, and try and reflect that. If you look at Marvel comics or DC comics as well, like one of the main sort of angles to that was reflecting the comic book experiences, and this is where MCU kind of started doing this correctly, because one of the great sort of hallmarks of my own childhood reading comic books was the idea of reading between different series, between Spider-Man and X-Men and whatever, and then being able to draw lines between them, because these characters would interconnect. There would be events in one comic book that would be sort of referenced somewhere else. There was an idea of a shared universe that was a part and parcel to this experience that they finally got right, because the right people were in place to do it, and they weren't afraid of alienating people who didn't understand it. And the idea of just being honest with yourself was, I want to say, the catalyst for their eventual success. But say, from that point onwards, you could see, it took, another 4 years for the first comic book movies to start making in excess of $1 billion. And they really peaked in 2018 and 2019 with Avengers Endgame and Infinity War, or the other way around, right? But ever since that time, and I know you might want to say, well, the pandemic kind of just like really threw a spanner in the works. It did and it didn't, because during 2020 no one made money, but after that we've seen the biggest amounts of comic book movies. I think, I don't know, 7 or 8 a year. They made nowhere near as much money as you could see over the previous 5 to 7 years, right? You could see that the trend is kind of sloping downwards, with the sort of the exception of the 2020 where no one made money. But you can see that you still have loads and loads of comic book movies, and they make progressively less and less money, with two exceptions, as in, I want to say Spider-Man reliably will make money. I think the last one made just about under $2 billion, which is a massive success. And then Doctor Strange, I think, made just under $1 billion. But that's it, right? All the other sort of comic book movies don't make anywhere near as much, but they cost more and more to make, so they are less and less profitable, right? You could argue that we've just run out of successful... I mean, maybe we've run out of road with bringing new characters that maybe people who aren't really well versed in comic books would be willing to take a shot at looking at, like Thunderbolts. I don't know, like, did people want a movie about Black Widow? Not sure. I mean, it still made money. Thunderbolts, I think, still made money too, but you can see that there's like a considerable fatigue with the material, and these movies are kind of sloping downwards. Meanwhile, at the same time, you could say, well, the pandemic has changed the game. It hasn't, because ever since the pandemic, the global box office has been steadily growing. It's nowhere near the peak, and the peak was kind of also, let's just say, comic book movies had a lot to do with what the peak looked like, because I think in 2019, I want to say comic book movies just in general contributed almost 20% of the global box office. So that's non-negligible. Meanwhile, now they're kind of on the order of, like, I don't know, 4, 5, 6. And there's plenty of them. Meanwhile, video game movies are starting to contribute like 4, 5, maybe 6% of the global. So their importance is climbing while comic book movies are on the decline, right? So you can see that maybe the pandemic has hurt everyone, but at the same time, I don't know, I can see clear sort of cultural exhaustion with the fully saturated market of comic book movies, which will potentially, they're on their way to petering out themselves, and they're also making a slow transition towards smaller screen, because Disney Plus is becoming more and more saturated with these titles itself. And meanwhile, the biggest sort of moneymaker may actually become the let's just say the quote unquote the video game movie genre. That's a future that we're potentially looking at, right? With some caveats, because I'm only extrapolating from sort of like the trends I can see. So I can see that the comic books have peaked and they're sloping down. Meanwhile, video games are ascending. This is subject to change, because this Christmas we'll see Avengers Doomsday coming out, and this will be probably like the biggest bellwether of it all, because if it becomes a stunning success, maybe it will lead towards a reinvigoration of the genre. Maybe the whole comic book movie experience will catch second wind. It will probably need more than just that. It will probably need another Superman film. So James Gunn would probably have to just have something to say about this, because we need more than one film to set a trend. Like, you need multiple data points in small succession to give a movement enough momentum, right? So everything's kind of still in the air, but it kind of looks that comic book movies kind of are facing this difficult question of their own future. Meanwhile, the question of the future of video games lies in the sort of the hands of Universal and Nintendo, because these are the biggest moneymakers around. There will be probably more, like The Legend of Zelda, Elden Ring. Alex Garland is making Elden Ring. There are a bunch of high-profile video game adaptations coming out, like the new Resident Evil film. That's going to be also an interesting bellwether. That's coming out later this year, directed by Zach Kreger. So look out for that. But based on their success, you will be able to then see over the next 3 to 4 years whether video game movies are here to stay for the next decade, the way comic book movies were 15 years ago. Okay. And you can maybe see that Nintendo and Universal are kind of sort of adopting the MCU sort of playbook, because they have what it takes. They have enough characters, likable characters, iconic characters and titles to sustain a shared universe, and they've already hinted at that with Star Fox being mentioned in the last film, or some rumblings being made about, like Luigi's Castle and whatever. So there's a lot of conversations about other titles from the Nintendo sort of space being brought to the screen, and maybe eventually they'll all kind of, I don't know, culminate in the massive Super Smash Bros. Movie. I don't know, I'm just speculating. But you can see that there's more to come, because the trend is on the up and up, and the reason why it is because comic book movies have left this space open for it to take it. So, you know, like they don't have to like elbow too hard for this and for the sort of the living space, because comic book movies are kind of sort of like, people are kind of, I don't want to say done with them, but I think they're in retreat, and they're in retreat to television. And also, this is not the first time this has happened, because trends like this just reverberate throughout time. Like what happened to westerns was kind of sort of exactly like that. Well, we didn't have shared universes of westerns. We didn't have shared multimedia universes, because what you had was only cinemas and TV, right? But when westerns went out of fashion in cinemas, they found their home for a longer period of time on television, right? Until they kind of completely fell out of fashion for at least a couple of decades, right? But you could see that this is a trajectory that we may be looking at. So we're now seeing video game films launching successful franchises, making considerable amounts of money, growing amounts of money. We'll then probably see their apex, or if they are supposed to become a sustainable trend, they will have to find a way to sustain themselves. And maybe the Marvel sort of MCU formula is the way to go, for at least for Nintendo, and maybe other sort of publishers or maybe other studios will figure out how to bring other titles to the screen in the same, like using that sort of playbook of being respectful to the material, reflecting the tone of the gaming experience, and making sure that you don't alienate the fan base while being accessible to others, and you'll kind of get successes over the line. And I think we're at a very interesting juncture, because depending on what happens over the next, I want to say 6 to 8 months, as far as big, large profile blockbusters are concerned, specifically comic book movies and video game movies, we might see either a revival of the comic book movie, which will make so video game movies kind of just, I don't know, struggle for air just a tiny bit more, or a complete cultural reversal, and we'll see a next decade of just a flood of titles based on video games, and some of which will be great, some of which will be terrible, but because that's just a fact of life. Yeah, let me know what you think about this. Leave a comment, leave a like, I don't know, do whatever, and then catch you on the next one.